We'll just wait for 1 more minute as the rest of the panel join us, and then we will get underway. And yeah, as if by magic, it's starting. There will be 2 further panelists to join us, but good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on Yorkshire's climate crisis, which is sponsored by Mcdonald. I'm Ben Ormsby. I am the Yorkshire editor of thebusinessdesk.com, and it is my pleasure to be able to host this event today. As a region, Yorkshire's policymakers have set some ambitious decarbonisation targets, aiming to be carbon zero in the next decade, which feels like it's fast approaching, it's safe to say. But that is going to require businesses to collaborate and innovate and transform how we all live and work. But it's also going to create some fantastic opportunities. So over the course of the next 45 minutes, my expert panel will discuss the opportunities that are going to arise from these targets, but also the importance of the need to drive these changes in the region. I'd like to draw all your attention to the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of the screen. We will attempt to answer as many of the questions as possible throughout the course of the session. Please, click Q&A, submit your questions, and I will attempt to do my best multitasking and monitor that while also keeping everything moving forward and to time. So without further ado, let me introduce 3 of my 4 panelists. I know we're still waiting on one to join due to a slight technical glitch. So Andy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, everyone, I'm Andy Gouldson. I am a professor at the University of Leeds. I'm also director of the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission and chair of the Leeds Climate Commission.
Fantastic. Kim?
Yes, I'm Kim Yates. I work for Mcdonald. I'm their European Head of Sustainability and Climate Change, but my technical discipline is climate change, carbon reduction, and helping our clients to net zero. I also had the privilege of getting our global company to carbon neutral last year on our journey to become a net zero company.
Fantastic. And Peter?
Hello everybody, I'm the Principal Environmental and Sustainability Officer at Transport for the North, and amongst other things, responsible for the development of our decarbonisation strategy, which is due to be consulted on next month.
There's one to look out for. And we will also be joined by Paula Widdowson, who is the Executive Member for the Environment and Climate Change at York City Council. I'm crossing my fingers that all the tech will come into play. So let's get started. We've mentioned those ambitious climate change targets. I guess, Andy, with your role on the climate commissions, how do we get to those sort of targets of 10 years? Is that something that the commissions have been working with local authorities on?
It's certainly a massive challenge. There's no getting around that. But in the net zero roadmap for Leeds, which the commission prepared and published a few months ago, it shows it's absolutely possible using things we already know about largely. And much of what we need to do also has enormous economic and social benefits. So yeah, there are challenges. We also ran something last summer called the Climate Action Readiness Assessment, which was looking at how ready we were in Leeds to do this. And it highlighted some key blockers, especially at the higher levels of ambition. And the main ones related to policy and the need for policy stability and certainty and clarity that would enable actors to opt in and commit and to develop the skills and make the investments needed, but also to finance. Those were the 2 main areas. In terms of whether it's technically possible or whether it's socially doable and whether people have bought into it, then the readiness assessment said, yes, absolutely we are. I think there are some other blocks in supply chains and skills and those kind of things where we need to develop new capacities, but with policy stability and with the right forms of finance, which may be something we can talk about later, I think we can do it, absolutely.
Kim, you sort of mentioned in your intro that you sort of spearheaded and led that transition for Mcdonald. How similar do you think the journeys that the regions are on is to those ones that a business is taking, and also what lessons did you learn over that you think we need to share to deliver that regional?
Okay, so I think we all have our part to play, and actually setting ambitious targets with short timeframes is how we ended up at carbon neutral last year. I went in with a nice plan to our chief exec and said, I think we can be carbon neutral by 2022. And he said, I want it by 2020, please. And that really concentrates the mind. And actually building on what Andy said is that the technology is there, the willingness is there, but certainly when we're working in this sphere, not just from a business perspective, but with our clients, etc., we tend to be working in a policy vacuum. But having that real clear policy and objective of 2030 for Yorkshire, it definitely concentrates the mind and it makes it achievable. And it also gives you something to hang your hat on as a business, saying, you know, we want to do our part.
That's fantastic. And I guess one of the ways that, well, it's often talked about a serious way we can start reducing the carbon target is through transport and better connectivity. You know, we've seen over the last 12 months with many people working from home, there were changes to clean air zones in cities and things, but also how the need to travel is going to change. How much is that shaping your plan that isn't yet launched yet or gone to consultation, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I guess possibly put a slightly different spin on it from Kim and Andy, and yeah, focusing on transport. I mean, the whole decarbonisation agenda is massively difficult. It's a massive opportunity too, but I think in terms of transport, that if you were to split it into sort of measures and say, well, there's technology focus, there's mode shift focus, and there's demand reduction focus. I think the technology focus, so things like EVs and how, you know, literally how we reduce emissions, but through sort of vehicle efficiency and things like that. I think there's enough startup investment and enough nascent profit potential that industry will find a way. And I think we can see that in the sort of rapidly changing EV market. But I do think that the mode shift and demand reduction focus change, so particularly behavioural change, is actually going to be really difficult. I think on the other hand, we've seen with COVID that, you know, we can make massive changes when it's to the way we live our lives, when it's really necessary, and that's in a matter of weeks that we did that. So I guess I'd agree with Kim in that having a clear policy framework at a regional level is essential, but go further and say that we really need national government to provide a clear policy framework as well, and they've got to provide that key leadership and set the tone, because it's that tone that we need to sort of grasp on and help up, you know, organisations like ourselves and local authorities to navigate those really difficult decisions and conversations successfully. You know, and that's things around road user charging, parking controls, stuff that we don't really want to talk about, but we really need national government to set the tone on those.
That's great, and we've got our first couple of questions coming in. So actually, there's one aimed for you, Andy, that asks, what do you think the biggest barrier for universities trying to reach these targets is, and do you have any solutions to those barriers? I'm going to imagine that the answer to the second one is not off the top of your head, because if not, you'd be a very rich man. But let's see what he has to say.
Well, I think I'm just wondering what I'm allowed to say in terms of our own university's footprint. We have really ambitious carbon targets, and I think, like all organisations and areas, we have a clear plan for what to do with our scope 1 and 2, our direct footprint. And that's ambitious, absolutely, but I think a large chunk of what we can do will get us a long way to where we need to be within the next few years. But I think when you factor in our broader scope 3 footprint, especially relating to student and business travel, for example, then there are some really, really fundamental challenges there. We, I guess, like many other organizations too, have been working towards becoming, you know, world-class, globally oriented, internationally connected. And how do we square that with a net zero target, which includes our broader consumption-based or scope 3 impact? There are real challenges there, undoubtedly. there are lessons that have been learned in the last year, obviously, with online education and digitalization and those kind of things, which could help in that space. But I don't think they'll get us there too. So, yeah, maybe it's a bit like Peter was saying. Some of it is doable. Some of it there are major benefits and opportunities, and it probably happen because there's a logic for it. But at some point, there are some major structural challenges which require a bit of a strategic rethink, perhaps.
Which leads me nicely on to another question that obviously we all hear it talked about, particularly in government, the green recovery plans and things like that, of the amount of jobs that are going to be created and the opportunities that they present. Obviously, the conversation isn't so free when it's talked about actually potential increases in costs. Peter's touched on it there with the idea of parking and the taxes there, or the inconvenience and things, and how we actually go about changing things that we all like to do. So, Andy, you've mentioned travel. I know Tom Reardon spoke earlier on an earlier session mentioning that that's a real issue for aviation. Is the aviation industry is always going to be a challenge, and obviously we know in the region we've got some fantastic businesses and research organisations tackling that. But how do we have a more cohesive and frank conversation about those challenging topics that allow people to therefore start looking at how they can shift the balance themselves, perhaps? Kim, maybe one for you.
Okay. So I work in the aviation industry, and as a climate change specialist, people often ask me, why isn't that the enemy? And you're sitting there going, well, no, ideally we want to be part of the solution, but because if we're looking at the aviation sector, the big elephant in the room are the flights themselves. But certainly as a region, it's building on, as you said, there's really good research going on at the moment in terms of alternative fuels for flights, different new types of aircraft. But the biggest elephant in the room is, do we really all want to be going on our holiday on a yearly basis, or can we be at home? And that touches roughly on what Peter and Andy were saying about how do we look at our lives and the way that we do things. And again, COVID has given us a great chance to all have staycations, which has shown again we can make those changes nicely and easily. But I suppose the other thing is that businesses like our business, for example, pre-COVID, 46% of our carbon footprint was aviation. Was flight based, and it means that we're having to make hard decisions about our business model because we're a global company, and those are real decisions because we want a sustainable business. We don't want to go out of business because of carbon in the future. We want to have a nice stable business going into the future, but we are having to make some hard decisions behind the scenes.
Which then I guess leads me on to another question. What long-term changes do you think that we all need to be preparing for? You sort of touched on one there, perhaps rethinking how we holiday. And I'm certain Welcome to Yorkshire would thoroughly endorse a more staycations a point of view. But you know, what things are you thinking we as the populace, we as the great unwashed, need to start preparing for? Peter, perhaps one for you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a lot you could say around this, but I think probably the bit I'd like to focus on would be how we can ensure that those long-term changes don't bake in long-term disproportionate impacts upon more disadvantaged groups, and use it. I mean, we're going to have a fundamental rethink of how we travel, and we should be using that as an opportunity to actually, actively reduce transport-related social exclusion, for example. So, I think, for example, people with lower middle levels of education, they tend to be employed in jobs with higher average carbon intensity. And many of those working in I guess, what we'd characterise as sort of process plant and machine workers, or working in the transport and storage industry. And we also know that those same workers are more exposed to labour market changes as a result of decarbonisation policy. And that might be direct. So to give you an example, if you were to move more freight to rail, and there'd be less opportunities within the road freight sector. But it could be in the vehicle manufacturing industry as well, or the energy generation sectors. But there's also opportunities for people with those types of skills, particularly around rail electrification and the massive investment we're going to need in EV charging infrastructure, the manufacture of zero-emission vehicles, zero-emission planes, their components. So I think it's about taking that long-term view and understanding where the disparities are, and making sure that we're not baking in further sort of inequity and disparity. I think that's going to be a really important long-term consideration.
Can I just follow up on that a little bit about the aviation issue and equity? I mean, when the Leeds Climate Commission published a position paper on aviation and carbon for the city, and as Tom Reardon was saying earlier, it's a huge issue with major controversies and quite disparate opinions around Leeds Bradford Airport. But if you look at the consumer side of it, then flights purchased by Leeds residents, if you accept responsibility for those emissions, it would add about 20% to the city's carbon footprint, its scope 1 and 2 footprint. So yeah, when you look at the equity aspects though, something like 60% of the flights are taken by 20% of the people. So really it's about, how do we deal with frequent flyers, including business travel, but Leeds Bradford's largely a leisure airport. How do we rethink the way we live in that space? Would it be possible? The other challenge here is how to take people with us and make this a legitimate thing rather than just, a green agenda that's kind of imposed on people and people then resent. We know what happens if you do that. There are kickbacks like in France and so on. But could you persuade people to take a holiday every other year and go for 2 weeks rather than 1 week? How do we address things like, city breaks and stag nights in Prague? It's those kind of discretionary trips which I think really add up, and we need to get involved in behavior change, and we need to persuade and take people with us. But in this case, it's the richer, more affluent people that are flying most, and we have to take responsibility for that and think about different ways of living. Absolutely.
I guess this ties into a question that sort of goes off what you just said. It's from someone who wants to remain anonymous, but question for everyone: do you see carbon offsetting via carbon credits as a good enough solution in the current climate crisis for a person, a region, a company to be viewed as carbon neutral? And that, I've heard people talk about it from an air travel thing of, well, I'm not going to give up on my holiday, but I will try and eat less meat and da-da-da-da-da. So is that a realistic approach that we think we can take?
Can I lean in there?
Yes.
So I think it's an interim approach, and it gets you, for example, to carbon neutrality. However, you need to have, as we've all been talking about, that longer term vision about taking carbon out of the atmosphere, because a lot of the offsets, well, you have different qualities of offsets, for example, that you can buy off the shelf, and not all of them are removing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the first place, and they're lovely schemes, but not necessarily what we would term as additionality. So they're not adding anything to actually removing that CO2 from the atmosphere. So I think longer term, it's actually looking at how we use our land management, for example, looking at new technologies, but also I think, again, Peter and both Andy have touched on making sure that there aren't any, I suppose, unintended outcomes of it, or any perverse outcomes in terms of focusing on just buying carbon credits, etc. It's very much the behavioural change side of things.
Again, just to step in quickly, when we looked at Leeds Bradford Airport and the carbon footprint from expanding the number of flights, we also looked at how much tree planting would be necessary to offset that. And it was tens of millions of trees in an area which was roughly 1.5 times the size of Leeds needed, Greater Leeds. I think it can play a part, and there are other reasons for tree planting. There's a biodiversity crisis as well as a climate crisis. There's flood resilience and air quality and mental health benefits and so on from tree planting, but to rely on it to offset expansions in flying, it's not going to do it. We have to be honest and clear about that. So yeah, there are real limits to what we can do through offsetting.
Obviously then, Peter, I guess offsetting transport is slightly, as Andy said there, it's tricky. You know, planting trees isn't going to suddenly negate the use of cars or vehicles or in whatever way. Do you see, is there a real opportunity therefore then in innovating? You mentioned electric vehicles and the opportunities that can provide, but also in upgrading that transport infrastructure. So the rail network, taking freight to the rail network. What opportunities are there and how much innovation is actually required?
Well, I think Andy said earlier, most of the technology is there or thereabouts already. But when it comes to transport, with perhaps the small exception of aviation, of course, the golden egg, if someone could solve that, but also the larger HGVs, the sort of future or the route is still perhaps not certain at the moment. But yeah, I mean, the opportunity is massive. It's a really positive discourse, actually. When we've been talking about climate change for the last 2 decades, it's mainly been pretty negative and adverse and scares people. But actually, when you look at the work that's involved in decarbonisation, there is a lot of opportunities there for everyone, I believe. I think our analysis has shown that by 2030 across the north, so not just Yorkshire, but across the north, we'll need 2.4 million chargers at least by 2030. So that's private and public, but that's a lot of chargers and a lot of work. Similarly, rail electrification. Rail operational emissions from rail are relatively small, but you know, if we're going to get to zero, we've got to tackle them at some point, and electrification is going to be the best answer for most routes, and including for rail freight. And again, I think past electrification projects have shown us that, you know, there's a real industry behind that. So yeah, major opportunities there too. But I think also, you know, outside of those sort of things, there's opportunities for our creative industries and our digital industries, and in looking at different ways that we travel, you know, looking at the interfaces with smart travel platforms and things like that, building on Citymapper, for example. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there too.
Which then I guess is, how important is it that we all collaborate and therefore engage organisations of all sizes to start thinking about this agenda? Because, you know, Kim, Mott, Mcdonald, big global organisation, and people working in it, it makes sense you're engaged. Some of the smaller SMEs might not know how to start. Some might be doing it better than others already. You know, how do we encourage that collaboration and that education at the same time? And is it through things like the climate commissions? Does anyone want to attempt to answer that one?
I'll have a go. So yes, we are a big global organisation, which actually makes it much harder for us, because I'm dealing with officers in India, officers in Asia, Australia, that all have their own regional specific agendas and issues. So, for example, when I'm trying to decarbonise an office in India, most of the energy supply is all coal-fired. So that is a very, very carbon-intensive office. So, but if you're an SME, you've got more flexibility to make those changes, and you tend to be more agile than well, quite frankly, a big lumbering organisation like ourselves. So I would say the opportunities are there, and it's also a matter of not being afraid of them. and understanding what's out there and what you can do. But the first and foremost thing is understanding what your emissions are in the first place, your scope 1 and 2, and then moving on to, as Andy said, your scope 3, which normally tends to be harder to get hold of. But when you understand what your emissions are, then you can start hotspotting and thinking, okay, I can start to reduce this, and this will have an impact on my business. The other thing to mention, and I think as we've all reiterated, is that if you make your business more efficient, you use less electricity, for example, it actually cuts down your costs as well. So it can be a win-win from that perspective, though there is always that, I suppose, cut-off point where you have to invest to save in the longer term. But collaboration is key, and we can't be doing this in our own little island because, as again Peter and Andy have alluded to, is that if we concentrate on just our little bit, we can be creating, I suppose, those perverse outcomes in the whole. So,
just to add about the role of commissions, I mean, the whole point of the Yorkshire and Humber Commission, for example, is to draw together key actors from across the region, from public, private and third sector, to collaborate on this. And I think lots of us who work in this area, and even more so organisations or areas, are often slightly overwhelmed by this. It's a huge challenge, and knowing where to start, being able to talk to somebody who's already done something good, learn from their experiences, and build up momentum that way, I think is really, really crucial. And it's a little bit abstract sometimes when it's a long way away. We need it to be invented here to some degree. And the point of the Commission is to facilitate those collaborations, provide a kind of safe space for tricky conversations at times, and to plan practical ways forward. And collaboration is at the heart of that. I think that the other element of this that we need to keep in mind is the so-called just transition element, that there are sectors and areas and people who may be working in high carbon sectors or dependent on high carbon industries in one way or another, who are deeply worried about this agenda. And we can talk about the upsides, fine, but we also need to acknowledge for some people they're worried about the downsides, and we need to be thinking about how to channel some of the good things, the good jobs, the good travel opportunities and so on towards the people and the areas and the sectors that feel worried about this. And the adage we often use is that Yorkshire knows all too well what a brutal energy transition feels like from the 80s. And the last thing any of us greenies would want to do is to repeat any of that. We want this to lift the whole region and be an open, inclusive thing rather than something done to people or to communities from above. That's not what this should be about, because, well, aside from anything, it won't work in the end. There'll be a pushback.
Well, picking up on that, on the importance then of sort of the inclusive agenda alongside that green agenda, what are the opportunities, particularly around, I guess, education? You've referenced there's going to be some severe sectors within Yorkshire and across the globe that are high carbon, and therefore pose a challenge to being net zero. Well, what are the opportunities for retraining and also for educating the next generation of talent, of people who are coming through, to start thinking about this, rather than us all having grown up in a world where, yes, it was talked about, but you're right, it was perhaps more in a different guise. What opportunities do you see with that education? Peter?
I guess, Ben, I probably won't talk too much about the actual sort of education itself, but I think, building on Andy's point about what are those opportunities, I think in the north there's a really clear one, for example, around hydrogen, where we've got a number of energy intensive industries which we could start to look at in terms of they either produce hydrogen or they could utilize hydrogen. And it's understanding, okay, well, these industries, the people working in these industries may indeed be worried because they're in a carbon intensive industry, but how can we use innovation to sort of turn that on its head and provide a whole new market? Hydrogen will play a part in decarbonisation. I think everyone's seen the news about boilers by 2025, and I'm not an expert in that area at all, but I think hydrogen has to play a part in retrofit. So So yeah, there's some really clear opportunities in the north to just repurpose, what we're really good at already, and I think we really need to sort of put forward our best foot and do it quickly, and almost lead government in that respect to say, we think there is a hydrogen future. We think this is how it could play a part in the north, and this is how we think we can be a leader as well. So yeah, I just wanted, I guess, to sort of emphasise that point.
I guess that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the challenge, as we said at the start, is perhaps policy can sometimes, it can be who's leading who. Does business wait for the policy to tell it how to do it, so it's got that surety of where to invest, or does business help shape that policy? How do we bring those two together is probably the ultimate challenge. Does anyone have any ideas? Kim, I could see you nodding.
From a business perspective, I think we have to be leading on that one and be ahead of policy, because again, it's shoring up your business for the future. This, unless you're living under a rock, climate change is an emergency. It is going to happen, and the businesses that don't shore up for it will be in trouble further on down the line. But I just wanted to touch on the point that you made about, I suppose, the younger generation and education. This is a prerequisite for any graduates or anybody coming in to work with us, is that we have a very we take the lead in the climate change agenda, and it's demanded, and it is a differentiator for us to be able to attract bright young things and keep them in our business. And quite frankly, my 16-year-old son knows far more about climate change than I do, because he's been brought up with it. So there is no escaping from that. And I think as businesses and as communities and as a region, we have to respond to that.
Going back to the point about policy, I think, again, one of the aims of the Yorkshire Commission is to allow the region to talk to Westminster and say, this is what we need you to do. We're itching to get going or accelerate what we're doing already. We're delivering on national policy priorities as well as global challenges. And at times you're not helping. We need X, Y, and Z from you. And I think that in the UK we have, especially in England, actually, not so much in the rest of the UK, we still have a major issue with the relationship between national government and regional and local government, if there is a regional government. That there's a disconnect, and there's a real danger, I think, that national government wants to do everything in a one-size-fits-all kind of top-down way. And the point of our commission is to say, well, actually, we don't want all of that. What we need is this. And for Yorkshire to speak as one voice with 5.5 million people, the same as Scotland, but without a Scottish government, to Westminster, to whichever ministry we're talking to, and say that this is what we want, and to articulate that clearly, I think is really powerful. Combined with the ambition and the leadership and everything that we can show as a region, to make that case in an authentic way.
So we've talked about the challenges. I think and I know we said at the start, it's very easy to talk about the positives, but I think it's important that we do highlight them. That what opportunities do you see for Yorkshire as a region? And I know I feel I've written it 100 times over the last few months of Yorkshire can be the key to that green industrial revolution, whether it's through the wind power coming through the Humber, or the hydrogen movement, or everything else that's going on. What opportunities do you see for Yorkshire and the businesses here to start taking that lead? Does anyone want to start with that one?
I'm happy to.
Go for it.
I think enormous opportunities, but also challenges to unlock those opportunities. Offshore wind is obviously a massive opportunity, but similarly there are other sectors around circular economy and bioresources and so on. But clearly the big one, especially if you're talking about industry, has to do carbon capture and storage. And had the government got behind that 10 or more years ago, would the Scunthorpe steel plant be in trouble now? I don't think it would have been. I think it would have unlocked an awful lot of investment in future steel production in a low carbon way. But that opportunity is still there. Imagine what we could do around DRAX, for example, with CCS, and using that as a magnet for inward investment and for high carbon sectors to move in order to connect to that CCS network. That could catalyse enormous levels of investment and job creation, and help protect UK PLC at the same time as delivering, significant advances on the climate change agenda. But there has been some movement in that space in the last few weeks. Big investments in Teesside and in Humberside in CCS. Are they enough? Is there a clear plan? Is it mission driven to really get CCS up and running within the next 10 years in Yorkshire? I don't think it is, to be honest. This is the exact point I was making earlier. If Yorkshire can make that case to Westminster about why we need clearer policy and more strategy and authentic delivery of that, then I think there are enormous opportunities here potentially.
Can I follow on there, Ben? Yeah. I think the Freeport designation at Humber provides an opportunity. That's Humber and Immingham, of course. And I feel there's something there in terms of sort of meshing together the hydrogen story, the CCS story, enjoying the sort of customs benefits and tax benefits that you get from those, because it's not just the free ports, of course, it's the hinterland that's included in that. So I think that all comes together into a sort of a melting pot of opportunity, really. And it's just how we sort of grasp it, as Andy said. And I feel like, we almost need to do these look aheads in terms of, what is the market for hydrogen, and where is the production coming from? How can we make it green? What is the market for CCS? How could it happen? And almost present that to government as a, this is how it could work. We want to do it. Support us, please. Sort of request.
So I suppose on that subject is we work in the infrastructure sector, and when we're working with clients on their net zero trajectory, of course, most of our emissions are from concrete, steel, and the decarbonisation of those materials is really, really dependent on carbon capture storage. And unless there is a coordinated effort to actually make that happen, yeah, well, it's going to be a little bit exciting by the time we get to 2050, to say the least. So again, it's that opportunity. Things won't carry on as normal. They can't carry on as normal, and allow us to get to that, in Yorkshire's case, getting there by 2030, but overall as a country by 2050, it can't carry on as normal. So there is going to be this change in the opportunity space, the way that we do things, and also changing our skill sets to take account of that. But also, I suppose, from Yorkshire's perspective, from a natural perspective, is there's lots of peat bogs, which is really, really good at sequestering, taking the carbon in. So maintaining the natural environment as well, to make sure that that's all part and parcel. But there's a lot of opportunities, but some very, very hard conversations on the way.
Which I guess then leads me on to answer another challenge that obviously we started this whole debate around the fact that Yorkshire's got some very ambitious targets. 2030, as we said, it's not that long away. That drive to be zero carbon by then, is that idea of perfection, is that an enemy, or is that something actually that we think is going to fuel those changes? Does anyone want, because trying to be perfect can be a real challenge, and if we want a region to be a leader, could we be shooting ourselves in the foot? Peter, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to say on. I guess my experience is that although creating targets is important to focus the mind, it can become very political and almost a preoccupation, and take away from actually getting on with the job in hand. But I mean, ultimately, 65% or a grade B isn't going to be good enough. I think we have to realise that we do need to reach net zero or absolute zero in many areas. So yeah, that's my view. Unfortunately, that's the way I think we have to approach it.
I think one of the things we're lacking, not only here by any means, is a kind of early warning system to tell us whether we're on track or not. And you know, we had this for Leeds recently. The Commission submitted its annual report to Leeds City Council, and this was pre-COVID. But broadly, it found that Leeds was decarbonising at perhaps 4% a year, whereas it needs to be decarbonising at 11% a year in order to meet its 2030 target. You know, so it's accelerating, and there's good things happening undoubtedly, but we need to redouble and intensify our efforts to meet that target. And it's massively ambitious. There's no getting around that. But I think it's much better to aim for a really ambitious target and perhaps miss it a little bit than it is to lack the ambition in the first place. So yeah, I think it's a fair point about whether the perfect's the enemy of the good. But you know, as Peter just said, we need an A grade on this. At the moment, frankly, we're not on track. You know, that there's a lot of momentum building, but we need to carry on doing more. And the point about the early warning system is it tells us, you know, whether we're doing okay or not. And we have that in so many other areas of our life and our economy. Why not on climate change?
And I guess then that leads to the thing that to achieve those, it requires funding. There's no way around it. Money drives things and gets things going. How can we attract that investment into those industries, into the carbon capture and storage, and how can we use that as an opportunity to not just make us greener, but fuel our economic growth for the future? As you said, the long-term plan, whether you're a business or a local authority, is a sustainable future. So how can we use the opportunities provided to help our economic growth?
Again, to come in just briefly, sorry, I don't mean to speak too much, but in Leeds, we know, for example, that Leeds residents have £2 billion sat in their ISA accounts. Imagine if there was an investment opportunity that people were confident in, that they could redirect that money from God knows where into their city, into low carbon projects in the city, and then swim in the swimming pool that their investments in solar panels help to create, meet the job that they help to make. You know, breathe the cleaner air that they help to make. You know, there is the money there, and the adage that, you know, you hear a lot at the local level that we have loads of projects and program ideas, but we just can't access the finance. And then if you speak to major investors, they'll say we have loads of finance, we just don't have pipelines of the right kinds of projects and programs. So one of the things the Leeds Climate Commission is doing, and is being done elsewhere at the moment, is to kind of inject that middle layer so that on the one hand, we can develop those projects and programs and make them investable. And on the other hand, we can connect them to new forms of investment, including community-based investment, so that people own their own transition. To me, that's massively exciting. It's really moving forward quickly at the moment, but it's still not there yet by any means. And one of the things we're trying to do at the moment is get a pilot scheme up to prove that it works at a small scale so that we can then scale it up and expand it quickly after that.
It's a fascinating idea, and I think it'll be interesting to see how, you know, the new infrastructure bank, when it comes to Leeds and comes to Yorkshire, starts that, you know, if it starts to invest in those bits of green infrastructure that we see it coming. We are coming very close to the end, so I will just quickly thank all our panelists for their thoughts. There will be a write-up of this session on thebusinessdesk.com, and some of the panelists will be around, I'm sure, throughout the day if you wanted to ask them any questions. They're all going to give me daggers now to say, no, we're not. But anyway, there is the expo area and a networking area, so please do take advantage of that. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the panelists, and thank you to Mott Mcdonald for sponsoring it. It certainly feels that there is opportunities to come out of this crisis, and we just need to find a way to grab the bull by the horns, so to speak. So I will leave you here. If you'd like to find out more about sustainable transport solutions as well, that is the next session, which is starting soon in one of the other rooms. So thank you very much, and yes, enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed myself.